The man known to history as James Connolly was born on the 5th of June 1868 in the Cowgate, a slum in the city of Edinburgh in Scotland, about half a kilometre from Edinburgh Castle. His father was John Connolly, a native of County Monaghan in the south of the province of Ulster in Ireland, where he was born in 1830. Like many Irish men and women of the 19th century, John left Ireland fleeing an island racked by famine, starvation and disease, and ended up in the Scottish capital working as a manure carter. James's mother was Mary McGinn, also a native of County Monaghan, who emigrated to Scotland. She entered a relationship with John, whom she married in St Patrick's Parish in the Cowgate in Edinburgh in 1856. In Scotland, Mary worked as a domestic servant, but died at just 58 years of age in 1891. James's early life was certainly hard, and there is no doubt it would have shaped his later political views. John Connolly and Mary McGinn were just two of over 2 million Irish immigrants who left Ireland in the middle decades of the 19th century, largely fleeing the devastation caused by the potato famine which racked the country in the 1840s and 1850s. Many went to the United States, but others ended up in countries such as Scotland, looked down on socially wherever they went. The Irish found themselves shunted into cramped, poor ghettos, such as the 5 Points on Manhattan Island in New York City. The Cowgate was its equivalent in Edinburgh and was known as Little Ireland. It was a poor, overcrowded and unsanitary slum with appalling living standards. It is unsurprising and wholly typical of the place and times to find that James only received a brief education. Nevertheless, he was an early beneficiary of the introduction of universal primary education in Britain. This he received at a local Roman Catholic school, St Patrick's Catholic Primary School. But although he left when he was about 10 years of age to commence working, his short education was formative, and he remained an avid reader throughout his life, as well as a prolific writer. After leaving school, he began his working life just as his older brothers John and Thomas had done before reaching their teenage years in 1877. When James was about 9, one of these elder siblings, John, left Edinburgh to join the British Army, which was a difficult career path at the time, but a clear way out of the grinding poverty of the Cowgate.
Meanwhile, in Edinburgh, having left school, James worked successively as an apprentice in a print workshop, an assistant in a bakery, and as a laborer in a mosaic factory. All of this was before the age of 14, at which point he set out to follow in the footsteps of his older brother John when he enlisted in the British Army. Unfortunately, almost nothing is known about James's life during the 7 years he spent in the British Army between 1882 and 1889. He may have served in India as his brother John had done, propping up British possession of the subcontinent at a time when a movement towards extensive social and political reform there was gathering pace. Connolly certainly served in Ireland in numerous places throughout the country, in the northwest at Castlebar in County Mayo, as well as close to the centre of colonial power in Dublin and as far south as Cork. It was while stationed in Dublin that he met Lily Reynolds, a domestic servant from a Protestant family from County Wicklow, south of the capital. It was most likely as a result of this burgeoning relationship, as well as his desire to abandon the nomadic lifestyle of the British Army, that Connolly left the armed forces. A popular misconception that he deserted to avoid potentially being sent on a tour of India is almost certainly unfounded. But whatever the precise circumstances of his departure from Queen Victoria's armed forces, we do know that he did so in 1889 and thereafter held a deep-seated antipathy towards the British military for the remainder of his life. Following his departure from the armed forces, Connolly returned to Scotland with Lily Reynolds. They were married in April 1890 in the town of Perth in central Scotland. They maintained a somewhat nomadic lifestyle briefly, as James acquired some work in the northern city of Dundee, but by late 1890, Connolly and his new bride had returned to Edinburgh, where James found himself working as a manure carter, the same profession as his father in his old home city. He and Lily then began raising a family, eventually having 6 daughters and 1 son, with 3 of the children born in the early 1890s. The young couple's marriage and return to Edinburgh coincided with a period of significant political unrest and change in Britain. The advent of industrialization in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution as it had been termed, had seen huge numbers of people flock to the cities to take up positions working in factories, often earning a subsistence wage, working 6 or 7 days a week on 12-hour shifts in dangerous working environments.
By the mid-19th century, there were growing calls for reform of labor conditions in Britain. This agitation extended to European countries such as Germany as industrialization spread to the continent. Some efforts to put this into practice had been made. For instance, in 1847, the British government passed the Factory Act, or 10 Hours Act, which capped work shifts in factories at 10 hours a day. The Factory and Workshop Act of 1878 subsequently regulated the hours which could be worked by women and children, but these only set a cap of 60 hours a week, and industrial labor conditions remained largely intolerable. The conditions created by industrialization were central to the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who in their famous pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, advocated for a type of extreme social and labor reform which placed ownership of the economy in the hands of the urban factory workers or proletariat. They called their new political idea communism, and while many reformers were opposed to such an approach, a great many individuals were by the 1880s and 1890s calling for reform of working conditions and better rights for workers. These socialists and labor advocates found political representation from 1893 onwards, as the Independent Labour Party was established in Britain under the leadership of Keir Hardie, a figure who had led a labour strike amongst Scottish miners centred on Ayrshire in the 1880s. Compounding this labour agitation was the emergence of mass membership of trade unions. This socialist reform movement was particularly prominent in Scotland by the 1890s. James's brother John had become involved in the Scottish trade union movement in the late 1880s, and James, yet again, followed in his older siblings' footsteps. Within months of his return to Edinburgh in 1890, he had helped organize a union for the municipal carters of Edinburgh. He also began widely reading texts of socialist literature, such as the main works of Marx and Engels, the latter of whose works had focused on the horrors of working conditions found in English industrialized cities such as Manchester. It is also to this time that Connolly's friendship with John Leslie dates. Leslie also came from a working-class Irish immigrant background. He had helped establish the Scottish Socialist Federation in 1889, and in 1894 he published a pamphlet entitled The Present Position of the Irish Question. It queried the Irish political situation in socialist terms. Leslie would also bring Connolly firmly into the socialist movement in Scotland, and as such was the formative character in the development of his political outlook. Through Leslie's influence and Hardie's example, Connolly's socialist activities increased in the early 1890s. In 1892, he succeeded his brother John as secretary of the Scottish Socialist Federation, and when Hardie set up the Independent Labour Party in 1893, Connolly was an early member. Simultaneously, he began writing extensively for socialist and labor publications and journals. Yet he still had a family to raise and support, and this was soon compromised by James's political activities. After speaking at a political event in Edinburgh in support of an 8-hour day in 1894, James lost his job with the municipal corporation. Subsequently, an attempt at setting up his own business as a cobbler failed, and by 1895, the Connollys were considering immigrating to the Americas with their young family.
In the end, his writings saved them from this move, as having become familiar with his work, the Dublin Socialist Club offered Connolly a position as an organizer in Ireland at a salary of £1 a week. He took it, and consequently, in 1896, Connolly returned to the city where he would lead a famous rising 20 years later. James would have his work cut out for him in Ireland in the 1890s. The labor movement was still a marginal force in British politics, a political establishment that was dominated by the Conservative and Liberal parties, and yet it was a growing factor in British politics. By contrast, in Ireland, the Socialist and Labour movement was almost non-existent. Instead, the country's politics was dominated by the issue of Home Rule. The Act of Union of 1800 had abolished the Irish Parliament. Consequently, for the entirety of the 19th century, Irish MPs had been sent to the Mother of Parliaments in Westminster. In the meantime, the country suffered for decades, with the bulk of Irish Catholics living in crippling poverty, Protestant landlords monopolizing ownership of the land, and increasingly trying to force small subsistence tenants off their estates in order to introduce new, more productive methods of mass agriculture. As a result, a number of major agrarian land reform movements arose in the 1860s and 1870s, but there was no major industrialization of Ireland through which a burgeoning socialist and labor movement to rival Hardie's across the Irish Sea might emerge.
By the 1880s, a growing movement was underway to have the country's self-governing once again. This Home Rule movement, as it became known, was championed by the Irish Parliamentary Party and had nearly succeeded in the 1880s under the leadership of Charles Stewart Parnell, the so-called uncrowned King of Ireland. Such was his popularity and political power in the country, and although ultimately unsuccessful, Home Rule continued to dominate Irish politics into the 1890s, though the Irish Parliamentary Party had split into two factions by then, led by John Redmond and Tim Healy. Consequently, the Socialist movement in Ireland, when Connolly and his family relocated to Dublin in 1896, was a very small political faction in the country. But the Independent Labour Party did have branches in Belfast and Dublin, and it was the capital's branch which had established the Dublin Socialist Club. Hence, Dublin was something of a change from the environment of robust socialism Connolly had enjoyed in Edinburgh. James's views on the country's politics soon began to be moulded by the prevailing nationalist politics of the time. He quickly concluded that in order for socialist policies to be effectively implemented in Ireland, the country's political independence from the British state would first have to be established. This belief may have been central to the dissolution of the Dublin Socialist Club shortly after his arrival in the Irish capital and the establishment of the Irish Socialist Republican Party, or ISRP, in its place. This would be a more broadly nationalist movement with a socialist underpinning. Connolly and 6 others were present at the meeting at Pierce Ryan's pub on Thomas Street in Dublin when the ISRP was founded. The foundation of the ISRP was a significant moment in Irish politics on the cusp of the 20th century. The manifesto called for free education and child health care and the nationalisation of the country's transport and banking systems. Most radically, it called for the establishment of an independent Irish Republic at a time when the prevailing view in Ireland was still that the country should strive for greater political representation within the United Kingdom. To propagate the party's views, Connolly produced a regular socialist paper in the years that followed, entitled The Workers' Republic, which was established with the aid of a £50 loan from Keir Hardie. The ISRP also began fielding candidates in local elections in Ireland and participated in the Second International, an international organisation of socialist and labour movements, also protesting against the Second Boer War, which had been underway in southern Africa from the late 1890s.
In the years that followed, Connolly's views began to crystallize. He wrote articles for the Labour leader in England in which he laid out for a wider public his belief that Ireland needed to be a republic in order to achieve an advanced state of socialism. He also began drawing more deeply on the spirit of Irish nationalist revolutionaries of the past, notably James Fintan Lalor. At the height of the Great Famine of the late 1840s and early 1850s in Ireland, Lalor had agitated for land reform to establish an agrarian republic, culminating in an armed rising in 1848. Thus, as Britain and Ireland entered the 20th century, we see Connolly's political thought evolving into a mix of socialism and labor agitation, influenced by Engels, Marx, and Hardie, and nationalist republicanism in the vein of Lalor's agrarian republicanism. In all instances, Connolly was clearly opposed to the constitutional reform movement of the Irish Parliamentary Party and their Home Rule platform at Westminster. Connolly was making both friends and enemies at home. His nationalist view that Ireland needed to attain independence was increasingly mirrored in the political outlook of figures such as Arthur Griffith, a writer and political agitator who had joined Connolly in opposing the Second Boer War. In 1899, Griffith established an Irish nationalist newspaper called the United Irishman, after the name of the Society of United Irishmen, who had attempted to overthrow British rule in Ireland in the late 1790s. More significantly, in 1905, Griffith set up a new political party called Sinn Féin, meaning ourselves, and its policy platform was to achieve an independent Irish republic. In time, it would profoundly shape the history of modern Ireland. But abroad, Connolly's socialist republicanism was not winning fans. While his fellow socialists and labor agitators in Britain were sympathetic concerning the deplorable social, economic, and political circumstances which British imperialism had created in Ireland, they stopped short of advocating the creation of an independent Irish republic and continued to favor moderate reform through the instrument of Home Rule. While Connolly's stance was perhaps alienating some of his socialist brethren in England and Scotland, it was increasingly landing the ISRP in legal difficulty in Ireland. The party's base of support remained largely confined to Dublin. In 1898, the headquarters in the capital was raided by the police and their printing press was decommissioned, temporarily restricting Connolly's ability to spread his political writings. This crackdown by the authorities in Dublin was due to more than displeasure at the publishing of the Workers' Republic. Connolly was increasingly developing a reputation in the city for being front and center in strikes, workers' protests, and the organization of trade unions in the city's factories.
These were aggressive maneuvers and had not gone unnoticed by the city's political and business establishment. In 1901, he was made a delegate of the Dublin Trades Council. Then, in 1902 and 1903, he stood for election to the City Council of Dublin. These latter efforts were unsuccessful, which was an indication of the limited base of support which any socialist movement could engender in early 20th century Ireland, even in Dublin, the only city along with Belfast with a major industrial footprint in the country at the time. Yet, for all that, Connolly had managed to successfully make himself one of the leading voices of socialism in Ireland, although his financial circumstances had never improved much beyond a mere subsistence. Whilst in Dublin, having arrived in the country with 3 children in 1896, by 1901 there were 6 in total, Ina, Moira, and Roddy having been born in quick succession. His wages were regularly in arrears, and the failure to gain elected office in 1902 saw Connolly having to resort to engaging in a speaking tour in England and Scotland later that year in order to make ends meet. This latter activity led to a new offer, which was to change things dramatically for Connolly and his family in the years ahead. In 1902, he received a proposal from Daniel de Leon, an American socialist newspaper editor and, since the early 1890s, the leading figure in the Socialist Labor Party of America, to undertake a lecture tour in the United States.
Connolly accepted, and having crossed the Atlantic, undertook a series of talks in the cities of the East Coast between September 1902 and January 1903. When he returned to Ireland, he found that the ISRP had been channeling its funds into subsidizing the drinking habits of its members in Dublin. For Connolly, a teetotaler who did not drink, it was the last straw to discover that his unpaid wages were being spent on the drinking habits of fellow socialists. In the weeks and months that followed, the ISRP collapsed as a political party. Connolly, now resolved on the back of the success he had enjoyed during his American tour, decided to relocate there. And so the Connollys departed for the New World in the autumn of 1903.
It might be queried at this point why the American labor and socialist movement was so interested in acquiring Connolly's services. Although it is not often remarked upon a century later, in part because Connolly's subsequent participation in the Easter Rising of 1916 has led other parts of his life and career to be ignored or marginalized. James Connolly was, in his own right, a significant socialist theorist of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His approach diverged from the predominant strand of socialism, increasingly favored by the Second International at the time. Connolly argued for a Marxist syndicalist position, whereby local worker-based organizations would advance the demands of the proletariat through strike action. This emphasis on local independent organizations differed substantially from the state-run socialism advocated by many of Connolly's contemporaries and the Second International. Indeed, Connolly's approach would become even more unusual from the mid-1910s onwards, when the success of the Russian Revolution of 1917 led to the adoption of statist socialism as the approach favored globally by socialist movements. The initial success of Connolly's tour of the U.S. in the autumn and winter of 1902 was not mirrored in his first years in America, having moved there late in 1903 after settling in upstate New York. In Troy, near the state capital of Albany, Connolly took up various positions in the years ahead, first as an insurance salesman and then as a salesman for the Singer's Sewing Machine Company. He continued his involvement with the Socialist Labor Party of America, but he fell out with the leadership in 1904 over a number of issues, the principal one being the socialist and Marxist stance on religion. The U.S. leader, De Leon, argued in favor of the traditional Marxist view that religion was in many respects opposed to a socialist approach. In contrast to the prevailing views of the majority of socialists at the time, Connolly took the view that religion need not even be considered in association with one's views on politics and economics. Connolly had been raised as a Roman Catholic, but he had largely abandoned any adherence to the Church in the early 1890s. Nevertheless, he remained firm in his belief that religion was a matter for each socialist to determine for his or herself, and took the view that any party interference in this would only serve to alienate potential allies. These tensions with the Socialist Labor Party of America led Connolly to leave that organization in 1907 and to join the Socialist Party of America. This was actually a much more substantial organization, and under its leader, Eugene V. Debs, had become an extensive grassroots movement, one which would eventually allow Debs to acquire nearly 1 million votes in the 1912 presidential election. As part of this newer, growing party, Connolly was able to garner an income from working with Debs. He also became editor of the Free Press, a Pennsylvania-based weekly socialist newspaper, in 1908. In 1909, he became a significant voice in the newly formed Industrial Workers of the World movement, having published a tract entitled Socialism Made Easy in Chicago in 1909, which for a time made Connolly a major voice in American socialist circles. Yet despite this latter success in the United States, Connolly had never lost touch with his base of support in Irish socialist circles, a sign of his continuing concern for the cause of labor in Ireland.
Whilst in America, this was seen in his foundation of the Irish Socialist Federation in New York in 1907, a major organization amongst the state and city's huge Irish-American population. It was through the Federation that he reconnected with his socialist allies in Ireland, notably William O'Brien, a fellow former member of the Irish Socialist Republican Party.
By 1908, Connolly was in contact with O'Brien about the possibility of returning to Ireland to take up a position in the Socialist Party of Ireland, a party which had been founded in Dublin in 1904 as a successor to the ISRP. As a result of his contacts with this new party, Connolly agreed to a set of speaking engagements in 1910 back in Europe. These ranged widely throughout Ireland, Scotland, and England, and the tour would be a pivotal point in Connolly's career, as well as being key to the trajectory of the remainder of his life. When Connolly visited Dublin in the summer of 1910, he was surprised by the changes. In the 7 years he had been away, the socialist movement had grown, not just in terms of the Socialist Party of Ireland's following, but more significantly in the support which had been built in Dublin for the Irish Transport and General Workers' Union. This trade union had been established early in 1909 by James Larkin, a member of the Independent Labour Party in Britain upon its foundation in 1893, and a trade union organizer who had cut his teeth organizing strikes in the docks of Liverpool and Belfast in the 1900s. More broadly, there was a growing nationalist movement. Connolly's old ally Arthur Griffith had established Sinn Féin in 1905, and there were many other emerging political and literary movements agitating for Irish independence, fueled in part by growing concern over a unionist movement in the northern province of Ulster, where a Scottish Presbyterian majority wanted to maintain close ties to the British state. Connolly's interest had been piqued enough by this visit to welcome offers to begin playing a greater role back in Dublin. Larkin provided the means to do so and convinced O'Brien and the leadership of the Socialist Party to make funds available to employ Connolly as a national organizer for Ireland's growing socialist and labor movement. When the offer was made, it was quickly taken up, and by the end of 1910, James Connolly had returned to Ireland with his family. It would be the last act of relocation in what had been a nomadic life since the early 1880s. Connolly's return to Dublin ushered in the most significant chapter of his career, both in terms of his theoretical writing and his real-world political action. Shortly after arriving back in Dublin, he wrote and published one of his most significant political tracts, entitled Labour, Nationality, and Religion. This was composed in response to attacks by the Catholic hierarchy in Ireland on the growing socialist movement, an initiative the clergy viewed as anathema to the grip the Roman Catholic Church held on the majority of Ireland's population. Connolly argued, in a similar vein to his writings in the US several years earlier, that socialism need not be viewed as inherently opposed to organized religion. Indeed, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and Muslims alike, Connolly argued, all needed to align together to overthrow the capitalist system. The closing sections of the work contained a clear indication of his revolutionary viewpoints in the weeks and months after his final return to Dublin. Here he wrote, "Socialists will not shrink from resorting to brute force, as socialism will not scruple when there is a question of finally superseding the old order of society to take up anarchist weapons, the dagger, the torch, the bomb." The candid utterances of the great founder of socialism, Karl Marx, who, with his henchman Engels, declared in their manifesto that their purpose can be attained only by a violent subversion of the existing order. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communist revolution. Labor, Nationality, and Religion was quickly followed by his most famous work, and such was the swiftness of this output that there can be little doubting that his views, as articulated in these writings, had been in gestation for some time while in America. Labor in Irish History, also published late in 1910, was the first substantial effort by any individual to interpret Ireland's history using a Marxist framework.
It argued for a militant nationalism, which would remove the British landlord class from Ireland through violent means, in the vein of insurrections such as that led by Lalor in 1848, rather than through the largely peaceful middle-class nationalism of the Home Rule movement and the Irish Parliamentary Party. Connolly also broke with nationalist tradition in being deeply critical in this book of Daniel O'Connell, the early 19th century Irish political reformer who had fought for the rights of Irish Roman Catholics nearly a century earlier. This militant nationalism was being expressed at a time when the gradualist middle-class nationalism, which Connolly was so critical of, was once again in the ascendant. In the UK general election of January 1910, the Liberals, led by Herbert Asquith, had lost their majority in the British Parliament. They now became reliant on the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by John Redmond. A second general election in December 1910 did not change the balance of power, and Asquith reluctantly agreed to pass a Government of Ireland bill in return for Redmond's support at Westminster. If all proceeded according to Redmond's plans, the bill would clear all legislative hurdles by 1914, and at that stage, Ireland would finally achieve a limited form of home rule, with an administration in Dublin exercising control over numerous parts of the country's governance. Thus, the middle-class nationalism of which Connolly was so critical was seemingly about to achieve success by the early 1910s. While this was occurring, back in the world of trade unionism and socialist organizing, Connolly's endeavors moved between Dublin and Belfast. In 1911, he became the Irish Transport and General Workers Union's main organizer in the city of Belfast, where the linen industry, and in particular the shipbuilding industry, had created a large urban proletariat such as was not seen anywhere else in Ireland other than Dublin. However, his work in Belfast was hampered by a general lack of understanding of the concerns of Northern Unionists. Connolly believed that Protestants and Catholics in Ireland should share a common goal of overthrowing their capitalist oppressors, and that the best means to do so was by establishing an Irish Republic independent of Britain. He seemingly never fully understood or grasped the fears of Northern Protestants that they would become an ethnic and religious minority within an independent, united Ireland, one which they quite correctly assumed would come to be dominated by the Roman Catholic Church.
It was this fear which led in 1912 to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers, a militia group of Northern Unionists whose goal was to block home rule in Ireland by violent means if necessary, a sign of the ratcheting up of political and sectarian tensions in Ireland as a result of the possibility of home rule. This was seen the following year, in 1913, when the Irish Volunteers were formed in response to the emergence of the Ulster Volunteers. In the months that followed, this Irish militia group began gaining adherents from members of Griffith's Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Brotherhood, a militant nationalist movement which had been formed in Ireland back in the 1850s. Thus, the potential establishment of home rule in the early 1910s was leading to the militarization of Irish nationalism and Ulster Unionism and the radicalization of both camps. Meanwhile, Connolly was involved in leading the most energetic period of Ireland's early labor movement. At a meeting of the Irish trade unions in Clonmel in the Irish Midlands in 1912, Connolly, James Larkin, and William O'Brien were the critical figures in getting all the interest groups involved to agree to the formation of a centralized Irish Labour Party, which would represent the cause of socialism, labor, and the trade unions throughout the country. Its name was the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party. The new party and its membership quickly became involved in the most significant event of the early socialist and labor movement in Ireland in the summer of 1913.
several business interests in Dublin, led by William Martin Murphy, Ireland's most prominent capitalist, met in the capital to agree on a systematic approach to prevent their workers in Dublin from unionizing and dealing in collective bargaining over their working conditions. These conditions were appalling in some instances. Some of Murphy's workers worked 9 out of every 10 days, often completing shifts of 16 or 17 hours a day. The goal of Murphy and his allies in the summer of 1913 was to prevent the organizations Connolly, Larkin, and O'Brien were running from agitating for reform of their working conditions. The spark for what has become known as the 1913 Dublin lockout was Murphy's firing of about 350 employees whom he suspected of having joined Larkin's Irish Transport and General Workers Union in August 1913. Tensions quickly escalated, with workers striking across Dublin and employers locking out employees and refusing them their wages. Violent protests followed as strikers erected barricades around Dublin, and strike breakers were brought in by factory and business owners to try to break up these protests. The unrest went on for months, affecting tens of thousands of Dubliners. Connolly had returned to Dublin from Belfast with his family during the lockout, but it ultimately ended in failure. Connolly and Larkin had appealed in the autumn of 1913 to their fellow trade unionists in Britain to organize strikes in sympathy with the Dublin movement. In January 1914 came the devastating blow that the British Trades Union Congress would not back such a measure. With the thousands of workers involved throughout Dublin unpaid and facing starvation, many gradually agreed to return to work in the first weeks of 1914, often signing contracts which promised that they would not associate with Larkin's Irish Transport and General Workers Union in future. In the aftermath, Larkin himself left for America, and Connolly took over the transport unions. Overall, it was a chastening defeat, but one which was decisive in the development of Connolly's unflinching commitment to militant socialist nationalism. Moreover, at the height of the lockout in November 1913, Connolly had established and become the commander of the Irish Citizen Army, a workers' defense force of several hundred men, which would play a critical role in the Easter Rising 2.5 years later. The events which would see the newly formed Irish Citizen Army engaged in outright rebellion in Ireland began to fall into place just months after the conclusion of the Dublin strike and lockout. On the 28th of June, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, in the city of Sarajevo in the Balkans. Europe's politics were already on a knife edge when this occurred, with two armed alliances squaring off against each other. Diplomatic tensions now spiraled out of control in the weeks that followed the Archduke's murder, such that by August 1914, a general war had broken out throughout Europe, with Britain, France, and Russia arrayed against the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The outbreak of the First World War had substantial consequences for Ireland. Redmond now pushed for the membership of the Irish Volunteers, which had already risen to approximately 140,000 men, to enlist and join the British Armed Forces, a move which led to a split in the Volunteers. The implementation of the Home Rule Bill was suspended pending the end of the conflict, but there was no mass call for Irish independence at this point. Yet the war had an impact on Connolly himself. He now drifted towards a more aggressively nationalist position, claiming that Ireland had no real enemy in Europe other than the British state. Moreover, increasing suggestions that Northern Unionists might be granted a breakaway state in Ulster in reward for their support for the British war effort led Connolly to write that the partition of Ireland by internationalist and unionist blocs should be resisted with armed force if necessary. This increased militancy was emerging at a time when many other nationalist movements in Ireland were drifting in the same direction, notably the Irish Republican Brotherhood. By September 1914, the Supreme Council of the Brotherhood had elected to initiate an armed rebellion in Ireland while Britain was distracted by the general European war. Two members of the Brotherhood, Tom Clark and Sean MacDiarda, were given responsibility for planning the rising. they were joined by a branch of the Irish Volunteers who had split from Redmond's control and which was led by Patrick Pearse, who had become the central figure of the rebellion which followed. Connolly had been planning a revolt of the Irish Citizen Army himself in 1915 when he was approached by the Irish Republican Brotherhood in January 1916 and was convinced to join them in their insurrection. The rebels quickly had a plan in place. They would mobilize the significant number of Irish volunteers who had refused to join Redmond's call to sign up for the British war effort. With thousands of these volunteers in arms, along with Connolly's Irish Citizen Army and several smaller rebel groups, they would stage a rising in Dublin and elsewhere on Easter week of 1916. An Irish Republic would then be declared, which would receive aid from Germany in the shape of arms and ammunition delivered to Ireland on board German ships. With the general scheme laid out, advanced planning was undertaken. Connolly prepared the Irish Citizen Army from the Transport Union's headquarters at Liberty Hall. It has often been commented that the manner in which he threw himself into supporting the rising so wholeheartedly was strange for a committed socialist throughout his life. Connolly's nationalism and republicanism had always been conditional on the idea that an independent island was the best means of achieving greater rights for Irish workers. Yet now, Connolly was joining forces with groupings who were militant nationalists, but also inherently conservative revolutionaries.
They were wedded to the idea of an island in which the Roman Catholic Church would play a major role and had no commitment of any kind to Connolly's socialist values. These were the individuals Connolly rebelled with in April 1916. The Easter Rising of 1916 was doomed from its inception. First, a German ship which was scheduled to land arms in the south of Ireland was intercepted by a British Royal Navy patrol, and the German captain scuttled his vessel rather than have it captured. Then Owen McNeill, the head of the Irish Volunteers, who had not been involved in planning the rising, got word of what was intended and sent out an order to the volunteers countermanding any orders they had received to mobilize on Easter Sunday from those who were plotting the insurrection. As a result of these setbacks, the leadership, including Connolly, met at Liberty Hall on Easter Sunday and determined to proceed in any event. The following day, Easter Monday, the Easter Rising consequently commenced on Easter Monday, the 24th of April, 1916. A large contingent of the Irish Volunteers, led by Pearse and joined by Connolly's Irish Citizen Army of about 200 rebels, seized the General Post Office in central Dublin, having occupied this major civic building in the heart of the city. Pearse went outside and read out a proclamation declaring an Irish Republic. It was signed by 7 men, Pearse and Connolly being 2 of them. It was their own death warrant. Other regiments occupied various strategic sites around Dublin. For instance, a battalion under Edward Daly seized the 4 courts to the west of the General Post Office.
While a relatively junior commander by the name of Eamon de Valera occupied Boland's Mill and some surrounding buildings simultaneously, small bouts of unrest broke out in Cork, Galway, and a few other isolated locations in the wider country, such as Enniscorthy in County Wexford, south of Dublin. But the rebellion was largely confined to the capital. The rising was not immediately suppressed, however. A few thousand rebels occupying strategic sites around Dublin City were never going to be enough to defeat the British government militarily. Yet, the Crown administration was unprepared for the revolt, and it took several days to bring in sufficient troops to the capital to suppress it. These regiments began arriving into the port of Dublin in the days that followed. They were generally cheered on by much of Dublin's population as they arrived, but contrary to the nationalist fervor it would later inspire, the rising was not popular at the time, and many in Dublin were glad to see the unrest brought to an end. 6 days of fighting in total followed the seizure of the General Post Office on Easter Monday and the reading out of the proclamation. The rising was finally brought to an end on the Saturday after Easter weekend. Martial law had been declared, the General Post Office had effectively been lost, and Connolly and others had only escaped by tunneling through to a neighboring building. Moreover, the people of Dublin were beginning to suffer as a result of the rising. Consequently, Pearse agreed to an unconditional surrender on Saturday, the 29th of April. When Connolly's Irish Citizen Army surrendered, he was gravely wounded, having been shot through his ankle. In total, some 3,500 people were arrested across Dublin in the hours that followed, while approximately 485 people were killed in the city over the 6 days the rising lasted. In its aftermath, most of the leadership was sent to Kilmainham Prison in Dublin, but owing to his injury, Connolly was imprisoned separately in a first aid room. A series of court-martials were initiated on the 2nd of May. These were presided over by Charles Blackadder, who controversially did not allow the defendants to have legal defense and held the court-martials in private, blatant contraventions of the legalities of how such proceedings should be carried out.
Moreover, many of those who oversaw the trials had commanded British Army detachments in Dublin during the Rising. As such, it was a clear contravention of military manual practices for them to oversee the trials. In total, 90 of the leadership were convicted and condemned to be executed. In the 10 days that followed, only 15 had their sentences carried out. Pearse was the first, on the 3rd of May. Connolly was the last, 9 days later, on the 12th of May. His injuries from the fighting during the Rising were so severe that he may have had only a few days to live anyway. In order for the firing squad to do its work, Connolly was tied down to a wooden crate and was shot sitting there. The manner of his execution caused outrage when it became public knowledge. The 15 men who were executed in May 1916 might well have been surprised by what happened next. Public opinion in Ireland quickly turned against the British suppression of the Rising, and in particular the execution of the leaders, most especially the injured Connolly, as public sentiment changed in the months that followed. The entire dynamic of Irish politics changed too. Support for Home Rule, which had been promised to Redmond once the World War ended, evaporated. Militant nationalism and the formation of an independent Irish Republic now became the favored route for Ireland. Accordingly, long-standing nationalist organizations, such as Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin, began to gain major support. The beginning of the end of British rule came in 1918 in a UK election held in the aftermath of the First World War. In December 1918, Sinn Féin won 73 of the 101 seats available in Ireland. This was virtually a clean sweep of all the constituencies outside of the Unionist stronghold in Ulster. In the aftermath of the election, Sinn Féin refused to take their seats in England at Westminster. Instead, a parliament was formed by Sinn Féin in Dublin on the 21st of January 1919. It met at the Mansion House in Dublin and declared an Irish Republic while also ratifying the proclamation Pearse had read out outside the General Post Office on Easter Monday 1916. Although a 2-year-long War of Independence would be needed to make this declaration a reality, followed by a bitter civil war over the nature of the independence the island would enjoy from Britain, there is no doubt that there is a clear line of events from the Rising, of which Connolly was one of the leaders in 1916, through to the establishment of Irish independence from the British state.
Connolly himself was buried in a cemetery within Arbor Hill military barracks following his execution in May 1916. He was survived by his wife and 6 of their 7 children. For many years, Connolly was remembered in a somewhat simplified fashion as a hero of the Easter Rising by Irish nationalists, but increasingly in more modern times, his socialist writings and pivotal contribution to the early labor and workers' movement in Ireland have been properly appreciated, not least his central role in the 1913 Dublin strike and lockout. His memory is preserved in many prominent places in Ireland, with several railway stations and civic buildings being called Connolly Station or the Connolly Building. Overall, James Connolly's contribution to Irish history, and indeed the wider history of late 19th and early 20th century socialism and syndicalist Marxism, was very considerable indeed. Rising from conditions of abject poverty in the Cowgate in Edinburgh in the 1860s and 1870s, he became one of the leading figures in the early labor movement in Scotland in the early 1890s. Thereafter, he spent extensive periods of time in Dublin and then the United States. Here, his writings on the idea of local trade union organizations organizing local strike actions rather than relying on international socialist organizations to achieve their goals were a significant influence on American trade unionism in the early 20th century. He is best remembered for the last years of his life, following his return from the U.S. in 1910. In 1912, he was a central figure, along with James Larkin and William O'Brien, in the formation of the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party, a party which still exists today as the Irish Labour Party. Then, a year later, he led the Dublin strikes, which resulted in one of the most significant labor agitation movements in early 20th century Europe, and the most intense action of this kind ever to occur in Ireland. But his most infamous moment was reserved for last. Connolly achieved heroic status in the eyes of Irish nationalists for his role in the Easter Rising of 1916. It was the manner of his death, more than anything else, which horrified public opinion in Ireland in May 1916 and slowly began the process whereby the insurrectionists became martyrs and the cause of militant Irish nationalism was given renewed vigor. In doing so, his legacy in Irish history was almost certainly much greater than he and his accomplices would have believed it would become when they began their rising at Easter 1916. What do you think of James Connolly? Was he principally a socialist reformer and workers' rights advocate, or should he be primarily remembered for the role he played in the Easter Rising of 1916 and the formation of an Irish Republic? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much.